My office setting, I have it set up to where I can't hear my voice through the earbud. But for some reason, I'm picking it up right now. And it's just enough delay to throw me off. I can actually hear my voice. I don't like it. All right. Let's see. We should be live now.
We are.
Okay. And I check.
Yep,
see.
I see us live on both of them. So.
All right. Let me know if you hear a weird echo or anything. Let's see. How about now? Okay. We don't.
I kind of get a tiny bit of feedback, but I think it could be my earbuds. So there's kind of a almost a digitized clicking sometimes or buzzing when someone
else talks.
Yeah, but I just actually again I think it could be my earbuds. So.
Does anybody have any conversations coming in on Facebook?
Yeah. Yeah. Jimmy Ray.
Yeah, okay, I just saw Jimmy.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah, and I see you
yours.
too.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, right.
All right. Let's see. I know I'm getting it from somewhere here. It's not supposed to be. So I need that one because that captures y'all. And all right, let's see. All right. Paul, how are you today?
Yes, sir. I'm doing all right. Good to see you guys.
Good. I wasn't really curious. I just wanted to test the sound.
Okay. No, that's great. I understand.
That's the way it is. All right.
I've learned to be careful about saying, "How are you?" Because sometimes I find out.
Yeah. Now, I do have. I'll tell you what. Let me try something else real quick. Hang tight. Let's see. All right. Nope, that's no better. Okay. And that may still work though. All right. Let's see if I can hear you now, Brian. How are you doing today? Nope. Okay.
I'm muted, John. I was muted. No, that was me.
Through there. Okay. Guys, we'll get started here in just a moment. I'm streaming from the house today and I have a minor technical glitch. See, I can tolerate the voice I hear in my head, but when I hear my voice through my ear about a fraction of a second delayed, boy, it's hard to concentrate. Kind of like when I'm talking to Rhonda.
Yeah, right. So now, are you saying if it was over 18, it would not be a minor glitch?
Actually, right now in my head, it feels like a major glitch. I can't remember what I did at the office to kill this. Let's see. had this problem in a long time. Let's see. But I can't make any major changes to the audio settings because it'll want to restart vMix. I'm afraid it'll drop the stream. Okay, well, I'll do the best I can. Okay. Well, that's a good point, Jimmy. We actually had a good bit of snow and ice, and it's starting to clear up, but we decided to stay in until after the lunch period, and then we'll get back out. And so as a result, streaming from the house again. All right. I guess it will remind me how much I clear my voice.
Right. Well. Like I always tell people, we're dealing with that cold snap here too. We're in the 60s.
My R's not working. Well, that's weird. Okay. As long as I can pronounce my R's, it's okay. It's okay, but typing the R's aren't. All right, well, let's go ahead and get the study underway. We're going to be picking up in John chapter 13, verse 18. Verse 18. So let me fade out, start the recording, and we will be right back. Greetings, folks. Welcome back to another Truth Factor discussion. We are picking up in our study through the Gospel of John. We're in chapter 13, verse 18. That's where we're going to begin here in just a minute. Good morning, gentlemen. How are y'all doing today?
Doing good.
Doing all right?
Doing super
We're
good.
doing okay. Or I am.
Yeah.
Tom,
Paul, how
Tom,
bad
how
was
warm is it
the
where you're
cold
at?
weather for you up there?
Yeah, I know the cold snap. Yeah, it's in the 60s. So
It was
It's supposed to
4
hit the low
degrees
70s
this
today.
morning. 4. We almost ran out of degrees. We're counting down.
Hey, Paul, if this was Edgar Shrigley at Florida College, 4 degrees. 4 degrees.
And I am wearing a turtleneck today in memory of EVS.
Oh, that's right. Let's see. Someone's knocking at the door. Mr. Bob's coming in.
Howdy.
Hey there, Bob. How goes it?
It goes pretty good, I guess.
Good. Good.
Oh. Had to run out for a late lunch.
That sounds like fun.
Well, early, I guess, but it was late for me because I didn't have breakfast.
Ah, I see. One more thing real quick. Let's see.
Brian, Thomas, Paul, how are y'all?
Doing all right.
Yeah, we are doing it. And for those who are listening, as we are, as our leader is resolving our issues, we promise we'll try not to keep you past the hour. So.
Yep.
So
Bob,
this is our time.
Bob, where are you located?
Macon, Georgia.
Okay, so it's not crazy cold there, I'm guessing.
It's in the 30s or 40s.
Okay.
My phone says 37, but my car said it's 43. So 37 is probably a general location in Macon, and 43 is what it was right here at my apartment.
The
It's been
we
colder.
lived out. I grew up in Georgia, and the winters weren't too bad. We did have a few of them, but
Macon, that's a nice little town.
yeah.
How long since you were there?
Oh, it's been years since I visited Macon.
The Dwarf House is gone.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Did the shut
been
down that
revoked.
whole chain?
I don't know about the whole chain, but it's just a regular Chick-fil-A now.
Okay. Yeah,
They tore it down and built new.
They had 3 places back then: Dwarf House, Chick-fil-A, and Truett's. But I don't know if Truett's is still open.
Truett's is still open up toward up closer to Atlanta.
Okay.
Up the road from Griffin.
You know what? I'm going to check one more thing.
Anybody else been to Truett's Drive-In around here?
Mm-mm.
If you ever go, there's a train, a locomotive, elevated locomotive that goes around the dining facility there, the inside. They got an old car, I think, too, on display there. But the Dwarf House is a Chick-fil-A, but they serve, the difference between a Dwarf House and a Chick-fil-A is that Dwarf House sells hamburgers.
Yep.
Yeah. And so the cows were on strike there.
I like that. Okay. I think we're close enough now to get started. I've adjusted a few things. Doesn't seem to affect the sound on the stream. All right, let's see. Let's go. All right, so guys, last week we left off in John chapter 13, right there in verse 18 is where we're supposed to begin today. In the preceding section leading up to this, we had talked about, we saw Jesus washing the apostles' feet, and he's kind of explaining to them what he did and the importance there to that. And culminating there in verse 16, where he said, "Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, it says, blessed are you if you do them." All right, any thoughts on that before we continue in this section? Anything? Okay. All right, let's go ahead and pick up with verse 18. Tom, would you mind reading for us? And let's go ahead and read through verse 30. Kind of get the chunk of the context in.
Okay, verses 18 through 30. And again, I will be reading from the New King James Version. It says, "I do not speak concerning all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled, he who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. Now I tell you before it comes, that when it does come to pass, you may believe that I am he. Most assuredly I say to you, he who receives whomever I send receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me." When Jesus had said these things, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Most assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me." Then the disciples looked at one another, perplexed at about whom he spoke. Now there was leaning on Jesus's bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask who it was of whom he spoke. Then leaning back on Jesus' breast, he said to him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it." And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Now after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Then Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." But no one at the table knew what the reason he said this to him. For some thought, because Judas had the money box, that Jesus had said to him, "Buy those things we need for the feast," or that he should give something to the poor. Having received the piece of bread, he then went out immediately, and it was night.
All righty. Thank you, Mr. Tom. A couple of things, of course, we're going to talk about as we go through the text here. Tom, he references in the course of this discussion, I guess we would call it a prophecy about this event, or was it more of a statement that shared a connection?
Oh no! Well, clearly, there is a prophecy here. Even though you go back to the original text in Psalm 41, this is one of those what we call dual implication texts. David is talking about an enemy of his, but yet the verse is used to describe what's going to happen. And I think when you look at verse 19, this was clearly a prophecy. It's not so much the verse 18, because we often find prophecies or Old Testament quotes which are related to New Testament events that from a direct standpoint of when it was written, it may not have been a specific detailed prophecy, in the same way as some of the others are. Isaiah 53 is pretty detailed, those kind of things. But at the same time, it's a verse that is descriptive of what is going to happen. But verse number 19, which if New King James is in red, this is a saying of Jesus. Remember, man put that red there. But he says, now I tell you before it comes, that when it does come to pass, you may believe that I am he. So clearly Jesus is telling them something that is a prophecy, and that leads into what John is going to explain, that is the writer, beginning in verse number 21.
Okay, that's a good point. Any other thoughts on that, guys? There are several passages in the book of Psalms that kind of serve as a dual purpose. As far as what the meaning was when David wrote it, or the psalmist, and then the forward application of it as we see in the New Testament. And this is one of several of them.
I consider those typical types and antitypes.
Okay, that's a good point.
David is presenting himself here in telling the truth about what happened to him, but it is preserved as a type of what would happen to Jesus, and Jesus quotes it, showing that he is the antitype of that. And I think that happens a lot of times where people will say, well, that's not even talking. I mean, like Hosea 11:1 is one. I can't remember exactly what it says right now, but that verse comes to mind as being a typical prophecy rather than an actual prophecy.
When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son.
Yeah, it wasn't talking about Jesus. It was talking about Israel.
Yeah.
But Israel there was a type of Jesus being brought back from Egypt, and after the death of Herod the Great. So I think there are a lot of those in the Bible.
Okay.
And so people say, well, that's not even talk. Well, yeah, I understand it, but that is a type, a prophetic type. And so that's how Jesus uses it. He is the fulfillment of the type.
All right. Tom, what were you going to say?
No, I mean, the point, I was just speaking over whoever it was that you quoted it. So.
Okay. All right. So as we continue forward then, he says, now I tell you before it comes, that when it does come to pass, you may believe that I am he. Of course, Brian, he's not talking about, well, what is he talking about when he says, when it comes to pass? We're talking about the betrayal or just the whole picture?
Well, I guess it could be both. Certainly, he's just rendered that there is a prophecy involved. And as mentioned, we go back there to Psalm 41. It seems to be talking about Ahithophel, would be my guess there. That and Bob has already mentioned the type and antitype that Ahithophel serves. But it's the idea that whenever you see that one of his closest friends is his betrayer, which is something Jesus has been telling him for a while that's going to happen. This isn't the only time he's mentioned this. This has come about several times, but when this comes about, it'll be one more verification, not just that I am. You may believe that I am he, which has been a big statement, right? He said I just did a sermon recently on Jesus making the declaration, you have to believe I am he. And what does that mean? But it's just one of these times where he says, I'm fulfilling every prophecy that sets up about the Messiah. So this will just be one more way you'll know that everything happened according to the way it was supposed to happen. And I always think that's probably one of the biggest ideas that Jesus seems to try to personally get through to the disciples. That this is all in accordance with a plan. that everything, because it doesn't seem that way when Jesus gets arrested and he gets betrayed and he's crucified. From their perspective, it's going to be, hey, everything just fell apart, when it's actually everything has just come together the way it was supposed to come together. And so he's going to make that declaration a lot. They're still not going to get it even till after his resurrection. They're going to be still kind of shocked about this, and I think that's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, John, looking at this, I was just kind of thinking about this, the quote, and building on what Brian was saying here. The quote, Jesus makes this quote from Psalm 41, and like he said, likely specifically it was dealing with that. But I want to tell you right now, regardless of the original intent of the psalm when it was written, Jesus quotes it, and he quotes it as a prophecy about himself. So in other words, he took words that were inspired that might have been applying to somebody else, and he said, I'm going to take these words and I'm going to tell you something that is going to happen to me the same way that it happened to David. And what Jesus says is a prophecy.
Yeah. Right.
What's interesting, by the way, is that both Ahithophel and Judas hang themselves in the end.
Yeah. I forgot about that, Brian. That's a really good point. Isn't Ahithophel? Let me think about it. Wasn't there two?
So Ahithophel was the wisest man in the age, and he was one of David's closest advisors. And then when Absalom rebels, he joins Absalom's rebellion against David. Now, a little side note that I always think is interesting: when you look into genealogies that are given, Ahithophel is Bathsheba's grandfather. So I've often wondered if maybe the betrayal of David was keyed in on what had happened with Bathsheba. That I've always kind of wondered, well, was this a grandfather who said, "Look what you did to my granddaughter"? And they never says what Ahithophel's motivation is, but it's just interesting. It is a side note. I know it's a little distracting.
Another side note about Ahithophel, isn't he the one that David prayed to God that God would confuse his wisdom and give Saul bad advice, or not Saul, Absalom bad advice, and the advice followed by Absalom led to his downfall and eventually his death, which David certainly did not want. He cried about that, but
that's what I was trying to remember. How do you spell Ahithophel?
Yeah, so when we get done with John, we'll go back and study 1st and 2nd Samuel.
If you will sound out the syllables in a word, you can probably figure out how to spell it, John.
Yeah, you would think so. I can't get a good enough start to my Bible program to tell me.
It is a P-H-E-L.
That's it. All right. I have a point, and I won't sound as unintelligible. A-P-H. There we go. All right. Spell it again, Tom. A-P-H.
It is, I said it's A-H-I-T-H-O-P-H-E-L. I believe that's right.
Well,
yep, that's right.
A-H-I what?
T-H-O-P-H-E-L.
I got this other voice in my head. It's really bugging me right now. So the point that I was trying to remember about Ahithophel is... That's it. Okay, I'm sorry. Let me bring it up here we go. Let me bring this over here for just a minute. And you'll understand what I'm talking about. I'm really not making good sense right now. So we had two individuals who were supposed to advise Absalom. You have Ahithophel, and then you have Hushai, the Archite. And he is the one that he comes and gives a piece of advice to Absalom, and Ahithophel gives a piece of advice to Absalom. Hushai's advice basically, and this is a broad paraphrase, basically uses the argument that we can do these things, and really builds up the king if Absalom will follow his advice. And Absalom takes Hushai's advice, and that's why Ahithophel kills himself. And of course, Hushai's advice to Absalom ends up in their defeat, if my memory serves correctly. I read a book on preaching years ago that kind of used this as an example of when you prepare an argument to present to someone, not make the argument all about yourself. I will do this and I will do that. But you make the argument of the presentation inclusive of people who are there. We will do this and we shall do that. It's an interesting example there.
So you only read one book on preaching, and it was years ago?
You could draw that conclusion.
You know, the other thing in this is, if I remember correctly, Hushai was actually an ally of David.
He was.
So
David sent him in there for that.
So his advice was actually the advice that helped David.
Exactly.
And I think it had to do with the direction that they went to pursue him. So
and that's what struck Ahithophel so badly. Is because his advice
Ahithophel's is the advice that would have defeated David.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
More actually, we can't say that because God wasn't going to let David be defeated, but it was the more sound advice that would have worked, quote unquote, strategically. Yeah.
Bob, that book was called Preaching with Imagination, so if that helps any.
Well,
it's actually a pretty good book.
I have seen your imagination at work.
Brian, I think you have a comment, don't you?
I do. On verse 22, one of the things I think is really interesting, somebody pointed this out to me years ago, and I thought, wow, that is kind of interesting. So Jesus makes this statement, one of you is going to betray me. And it's interesting that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or at least Matthew and Mark, they all say, who's he talking about? Is it me? Is it me? And of course, here it says they're perplexed, and they're saying, who is it? You know, and even verse 24 and 25, they're asking, who is it? Who is it? And somebody pointed out to me once that it's surprising that not everybody looks at Judas and says, well, we know, because, you know, Jesus always gives Judas the side eye. Or, I mean, way back in John 6, he said, you know, one of you is going to betray me. When they confessed, they all said, you're the Lord. And Jesus said, yet one of you is going to still betray me. And what's incredible is Jesus knew Judas was going to betray him from the get-go. But Jesus never treated Judas any differently so that everybody else knew that. And I'd never thought about that till somebody pointed that out. And I thought, yeah, you know, if I knew I have 5 kids and one of my kids is going to kill me, you know, as a kind of a humorous anecdote, I would probably treat the one child differently. You know, I would probably, the 4 kids that are going to be good and the one that's not, you know, I might treat them differently. But the point is, Jesus never treated Judas any differently, so that everybody's in Acts chapter 1, when they're talking about one of us fell, you know, they're all as surprised as they could be, because they just didn't see Judas betraying them. They just couldn't see that was going to happen. So to me, number one, it's really remarkable that Jesus was utterly fair, and that there's no sense that Judas ever had a sense of, well, you know, Jesus never liked me anyway, because when the time comes, nobody guesses who it is. It's not, you know, and even when it happens and Judas runs out the door, they're not even guessing, oh, you know, Judas is running out. But number two, the second thing I think is interesting is that in Matthew, Mark, they're all asking, is it me? And I've actually found that to be one of the most interesting questions in the Bible, because why would you ask if it's you? In other words, if John, you said, hey, on this panel, one of you is going to do something, I wouldn't, you know, is gonna kill me, you know, I wouldn't say, is it me? Because I would know it wasn't me. You know, I would say, well, obviously I'm not the one who's doing it. And I've never trusted Paul over there. So, you know, but I would never think it's me unless maybe I have thought of doing something. And so I've always wondered why they asked that. And like I said, and I'm going to be very careful because I'm clearly stepping into a line of supposition. We don't know why they ask, is it me? It's just such an interesting question. By the end of the night, they're all going to betray Jesus. You know, they're all going to run and hide. And Jesus predicts that here in the next couple of chapters, that all, you know, when the shepherd is struck, the sheep are going to flee. So I think that, you know, one of the things we kind of miss here is that again, they're all, when he says one of you is going to betray me, they're not shocked and say, well, it's one of you guys. They're even asking, am I? And I have to think, you've been on this trail for 3 years. You've been waiting for the kingdom to come. It's not yet come. You're still bickering with each other. In fact, in Luke, I think this conversation is what triggers the bickering of who's the greatest among them. So it's it might be the kind of thing. Maybe some of these guys are thinking, I think I'm done. I want to go back home. This really hasn't gotten anywhere. I don't know. But I just am fascinated by this.
It's interesting in contrast with Peter, who on an occasion says, everybody else might, but not me. And it's interesting in contrast that on this occasion that Peter says, well, he doesn't make that grand statement. He says, well, who is it? And so I think you bring out something that we can't know the answer to, but it's really interesting to consider, and that they all consider themselves, I guess, fallible. Say, well, could it possibly be me who would do such a thing? And so I think that's really interesting to think about, Brian.
Right. That is a great, that's a great, I've never thought about it from that standpoint. But, when you think about this, how often has Jesus corrected the apostles? What I'm saying is, throughout they say something and they don't get it, and Jesus has to reel them in. So often he's had to do that. So that's a good point. But I wonder, they're legitimately questioning. Am I going to fail again? Am I going to misunderstand you again? So that is a good point. And then there's also the other question, at least early on, did Judas really know that he was going to betray him at the time that Jesus said it early on? You got that obviously he was of the character where he could, but had he already put it in his mind, oh yeah, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to go talk to the leaders and see what they'll give me to show up where Jesus is in a secluded place. Yeah, and all the things that we've talked about. And Judas was probably thinking, well, I'm going to pocket 30 pieces of silver, and Jesus is going to get away again. Those kinds of things. But interesting thoughts.
Yeah, we'll talk about that here a little bit more in just a second, in relation to a comment that David Clark dropped in. But before we do that, I do find it interesting that in verses 23 and 24, Peter turns to John, or maybe leans over to John, and says, ask him who he's talking about. Assuming John is the disciple whom Jesus loved there. Peter asks him to ask Jesus about it. And so he does. And verse 26, we kind of get an answer to that question. He said, it is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it. And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. And after the piece of bread, it says, Satan entered into him. Then Jesus said to him, what you do quickly. And I'm flabbergasted a little bit what we see in verse 28. No one at the table knew for what reason he said this to him.
Yeah, back in verse 2, John had already pointed out, and supper being ended, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. And so it was before now. He's been thinking about it, and he may have already made his pact for 30 pieces of silver, or at least has.
Well, let's go ahead and bring in David's comment real quick. And we can talk a little more about this, Bob, as we go through here. David Clark says, was it greed that Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus? Was his determination to betray him based upon greed? And is Satan a spirit as well? Any thoughts or comments on that?
So,
I do think it's greed myself. Oh, sorry, Brian. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say it does seem to be something to do with greed. We're never specifically told all the motivations. We and I always think sometimes when the Bible's not too specific, the speculation is more valuable in the sense of asking a question of ourselves. Well, what would it take for me to betray Jesus? I think the significance here is, why is it that he will betray him? For many reasons. You do say greed because there is this language that identifies greed as being one of the things about him, having been a thief and stealing money out of the box. So that's the sense of this, that it could be. I was coming back to the idea of Satan entering him. Luke also uses that term, Satan entering him. And I think we have to be careful and not see this as a demonic possession. I think it's more the idea that Satan enters him by the way that, actually the way that Bob just mentioned, that back in the first two, that Satan has put it in him to do this thing. And I think it's probably the same way that in Matthew chapter 16, the Bible, talks about Peter saying, I'm not going to let anything happen to you, Jesus. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. He says, you're being mindful of worldly things and not spiritual things here. And I think that that's probably the language of Satan entering him, not a demonic possession, but more of the idea of Satan giving him the desire, or allowing the desire to enter him, just the way Satan works with any of us. That he operates in the world today through the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, pride of life. So it's one of those three vectors that Satan manipulates Judas to do the thing he's going to do.
And I would suggest that the manipulations of Satan today are as mysterious as the providence of God.
There you go.
I mean, God can use probably more things to accomplish his will than Satan can, but Satan's got a lot of power, and we don't really know. I mean, we know that he doesn't have the power that he had in the first century, or is not allowed to exercise it today, but he can still exercise the power of deceit, and so we just don't know how he goes about that always.
This past week, I've been listening to a sermon while I walk. Somebody was talking about, quote unquote, the providence of Satan. Making that also. We never think of it that way, but but is he able to do things like that? Obviously the point is limited. He is limited, but God gave him permission to go so far, even though he's on a leash.
Just like he did with Job.
Exactly.
And by the way, a lot of people, I was among them at one time in my life, think of the table as in the way that we sit at the table, with chairs, a table elevated on legs and a chair under that we sit on. But they did not do that. They stretched out their feet behind them, their elbow on the edge of the table, and they would eat with their fingers. And so they were lying out, and so they would lie side by side, and this would account for John leaning back on Jesus' breast. He was the nearest one to him, but Jesus was still behind him, so he had to lean back and say something to him, which wouldn't make sense if they were sitting in chairs, but they didn't sit in chairs. And I do think that John is the disciple whom Jesus loved. Yeah. I think everybody else is excluded.
All right, let's see. Have a few comments in the chat room. Jimmy, he says, was this referring to the Passover feast, or am I way off? No, this was the night of the Passover feast. Yeah.
But it's after.
Yeah, after.
Yeah, he is already, like in verse 2, it says after supper being ended. So he's already established a supper.
Yeah.
So
right.
I will say, it is confusing because verse 1 says it's before the feast of the Passover, but then verse 2 says it's after they ate the Passover. And typically what we think is going on here is this is a very confusing one of those times where there almost seems to be 2 days of Passover. And there's some ancient history that testifies to the idea that the Passover was celebrated over 2 days because there were two traditions as to how to follow that between the Galileans and the Judeans. And so a lot of people think that what is happening is that John is referencing the Passover for the Judean community, whereas like Matthew and Mark are, especially, and Luke are tying it more to the Galilean practice of the day before. So it's a little confusing, Jimmy. Actually, it is a little confusing because the way it talks about the Passover is almost as though it's a 2-day thing, and in the Old Testament it was only a 1-day thing. But actually, sometimes it's talked about as a 7-day thing, so that could be.
And we do
even more
need to
confusing.
make a distinction, and you just hit on that, Brian, between the day of the Passover. That was 1 day, the 14th of Abib. And then the feast of the Passover, which was 7 days following that. And so that Friday that Jesus was crucified, that was Passover. But it was also the preparation day for the Sabbath day. And on the Sabbath day, the 7-day feast began. That's why that Saturday was a holy day, because it was. And so the feast has not yet begun. It begins the day after the day of the Passover, on the 15th of Abib. And so they've eaten the Passover, but the feast has not yet begun. It does not begin until the daylight hours, or perhaps until 6 p.m. The next day. So I think there's that distinction that helps a little bit.
Right. And it is in that sense that Jesus can literally be the Passover once and for all.
Yeah. Let's jump to another question, and I think this is a good one. It's a good question. David says, so Brian, why make him a disciple? Talking about Judas. If Jesus knew that Judas was going to do this, why make him a disciple?
And it's a great question. And the answer is because that was part of the plan. And I took a quote out of Luke 24 where Jesus is trying to explain this, after his resurrection, he's trying to explain to his apostles in Luke 24 and verse 46, where he says, it's written, it's necessary that all of this had to happen this way. And so that includes that there had to be somebody betray him. And like I said, we knew there was somebody going to betray him even before Judas was born. Because we have these prophecies like Ahithophel, like the conversation we had about Ahithophel, which was 1,000 years before we saw and again, Bob used the word, the type and antitype, or foreshadow and shadow. This idea that this is a foreshadow of the thing that is to come. It was always meant to happen that way, that it would be one of Jesus's closest confidants that would betray him. That was part of the prophetic way, so that was necessary to happen.
Plus the prophecy quoted by Peter in Acts chapter 1. His bishopric let another take. And so there was going to be another apostle appointed in the place of Judas, because Judas was going to fall by betrayal, and then he was going to kill himself. And so they would need another one, because Jesus said, you shall sit on 12 thrones. Well, there wouldn't be a need for 12 thrones if there were only 11 apostles. And so Matthias was then chosen by God through the casting of lots, and there was 12 again. And interestingly, even the Apostle Paul does not seem to perform an apostolic miracle until after the death of James, the brother of John. And so there's still just 12 main apostles when Paul joins the band.
Okay. I hadn't really thought about that comparison, about when Paul compared to James, or taking the place of James.
When Paul struck Elymas blind,
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure that's the first recorded miracle of Paul.
It is. Acts 13.
Yeah. And of course, James was killed in chapter 12, or the account is in chapter 12.
Yeah. All right, let's bring in another question real quick from Stephanie. And there we go, sorry. Stephanie says, question, in Luke 22:31, Jesus comforts Peter, yet in Luke 22:21-22, betrayer is not given any comfort. All right, let me bring up both of those passages there, just to kind of get a bit of context to it. The first one is Luke chapter 22, verse 31. And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, indeed Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat, but I prayed for you that your faith shall not fail, and when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. All right, so then the question pertains to then what happens here in verses 21 and 22 of the same chapter. And so we'll back up to that. And starting in verse 20, likewise he also took the cup after supper. Verse 21, he says, but behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on this table, and truly the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. I wonder if the answer to Stephanie's question is in the word betrayed.
So I think it's
Bob,
a great question.
muted.
Oh, Bob, go ahead.
If you watch The Chosen, Jesus does tell Judas Iscariot, I'll pray for you.
You know, I think this is a really neat question.
Yeah.
And I honestly, I'm going to have to say I don't have a good answer for it. But I'm going to throw my thought about what could be the answer, and it could be the idea that Jesus, when he's telling Peter, when you have returned, he says in verse 31, or 32, he says, when you have returned, you can strengthen your brethren. That Jesus is having these conversations from a position of foreknowledge. That perhaps it is the case that Jesus knows Peter will return, but he knows Judas will not. And so, these words of comfort to Peter are, Peter, because I don't doubt that Peter prays for, or Jesus has prayed for all of his disciples. I mean, John 17, he's praying for him. He does kind of make that, actually I have to step back there and say he does click about Judas, but, he has prayed for his disciples. He has cared about them. But I think in the end, perhaps it's that foreknowledge that I know Peter will come back and I know Judas will not. That's why he has these statements like this. Typically, and I guess everybody on the panel will agree with this, we probably would say that Judas could have repented of what he had done. We probably almost all would agree that Judas could have repented. He simply did not. He simply allowed his, to be overwhelmed by his grief, or, like I said, again, I'm almost speculating too much about what his motivation, what his feelings are. But, I think we would all agree he could have repented, because they are all guilty effectively of betraying the Christ. That tends to be our mindset. I mean, what you see in Luke in particular, or Mark in particular, but all the Gospels will say that when Peter betrays Jesus by denying him 3 times, one of them, I think it's in Mark, says that Peter actually curses Jesus. I mean, wow, Judas didn't even do that. So I always think, we focus on Judas as being the ultimate betrayer, and in many ways, yeah, he is, but maybe he's the ultimate betrayer because he doesn't repent, whereas everybody else repents and mourns this and turns back to Christ. And so maybe that's why he talks this way. But I don't have a good answer for you otherwise.
I had to answer the phone just then, and you might have brought this up about what happened immediately after Peter's 3rd denial. He looks at Jesus, and Jesus is looking at him.
Yeah, in Luke's account.
And he weeps. And to me, that's the difference between the two. Peter experiences a godly sorrow, whereas Judas experiences a worldly sorrow. He doesn't see how he can face anybody now, that kind of thing. And so he just goes out and hangs himself, like a lot of people who take their own lives today because they can't live with what they've done. You can, if you'll seek forgiveness from God, and which is what Peter did. And so he was penitent, and he did return, and he did become a big encourager and the unofficial leader of the apostles.
Okay. A comment came up earlier, I think, when we were looking at David's question about why pick Judas as a disciple. And here's something to consider also. It would have been one thing if the Pharisees, they had attacked Jesus and all of his disciples stood by his side. You had had a little bit different story told. But in this case in point, when Judas betrayed him, it was one of his very own who was willing to sell him. And I like the comments you made about Peter and his denial of Jesus. But with Judas, he didn't simply deny Jesus, he actually sold him, betrayed him by selling him to them. And I think that maybe, I don't want to say ups the ante on his sin, but it takes him, I mean, he was right there with Jesus. He was supposed to have been one of his apostles and was with them all the time, but yet he was willing to sell him. And it could also have to do with the fact that, it also have something to do with the fact that he went out and took his own life. And that was kind of Marcia's question in regards to this. Marcia says, I'm a bit curious to know how suicide was viewed in Bible times. Did Jesus know that Judas's demise was going to be like that? And I think there is an Old Testament prophecy referenced, isn't there, regarding, maybe there's not, the death of the one who would do this.
It's quoted in by Peter in Acts chapter 1. So I can find it right here, right quick.
Oh, I forgot to bring up Marcia's comment. You talking about there? Let's see, in verse 20.
It is written in the book of Psalms, let his habitation be desolate, let no man dwell therein, and his bishopric let another take. His habitation was the field of blood that was purchased by the 30 pieces of silver that he returned to the temple. And so the priests, they didn't want to put that money back in the treasury. It was blood money. And so they purchased a field with it and to bury strangers in. And it was called the field of blood for two reasons. One, it was bought with blood money. And again, the other reason was, I forget, it's given here somewhere.
Let another take his office.
Say it again.
Let another take his office.
Yeah, that's the quotation.
Yeah,
from Psalms 109, verse 8.
His habitation be desolate, let no man dwell therein. So it's a graveyard. And again, purchased by the blood money. And then his bishopric let another take.
Any thoughts on the suicide question regarding their thoughts in the first century?
You know, I can't believe that suicide has ever been viewed as anything but negative. Somebody at his wit's end. I don't think it takes courage to commit suicide. I think it takes courage to face life. Suicide is committed by those without courage. They can't face what they've done.
There are 6 suicides in the Bible. I usually don't put Samson in that because I don't think his goal was to take his life. His goal was to destroy his enemies. But other than Samson, there are 6 suicides in the Bible, and they're all people in a depraved, godless moment. And with Saul and Saul's shield bearer, or I just forgot the king that set himself on fire, Ahithophel. That the few times we do see a suicide, they're almost always somebody who is utterly lost their hope and a relationship with God. So, the Bible certainly gives us, and I think all of us probably appreciate and understand the idea that taking somebody's life, even taking our own life, is destroying the life of an image of a life made in the eyes of God. Whenever the Amalekite that helped Saul kill himself is caught by David, David says, you murdered somebody, even though that guy was killing himself. This we could call assisted suicide was an act of murder. So suicide itself is an act of murder, we would say.
Yeah.
Hey, John.
Yep.
Not so much on the suicide, but tying it back to our context and so on, talking about the betrayal. Mm-hmm. I don't know if this means anything, but the word betray is never used about Peter. Yeah. I mean, if you think about the difference between Peter and Judas, what Judas did was intentional and deliberate. What Peter did was weakness. I mean, it was the weakness of the moment. I mean, it was an act that you would say, in a sense, it was an act of betrayal, but not in any way in the same way as Judas. What Judas did was deliberate, and so on and so forth. So I just think that's interesting. The word deny is what's used for Peter, and Satan will sift you as wheat and those types of things, but never the word betray is used with this.
That's a good point. Judas may have truly viewed his situation as being completely and utterly hopeless, or the only way to make right what he had done wrong was to terminate his own life. I don't know. Yeah. All right, but I do think that's a good point about how that the Lord, and I think, Brian, you said this a while ago, alluded to this in regards to the foreknowledge of Jesus. Even when he chose the apostles, he knew the difference between Peter and Judas. He knew what Peter would do, and he knew what Judas would do. And the ultimate outcome of both men, I think, reflect what Jesus knew about them and why they were chosen.
Yeah, and by the way, tying it up, because I know we're out of time, but looking at the entire context that we've dealt with here, even after Jesus does this with John and Peter, kind of gives them an identifier. He tells Peter or Judas to go out and what you do quickly. And he leaves, and even then they didn't get exactly what Judas was going to do and when he was going to do it. They just thought he was doing something different.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think it's a very good point, Tom. They did not know. Even with what was said, they did not understand what he was going out to do.
Right, yeah. And that could help lead to the end of this text if you want to start with another verse next week.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's go ahead and plan to continue this next Thursday. We'll pick up in John chapter 13, verse 31, and we should be able to make it to the end of the chapter and possibly get into John chapter 14. Yeah. All right, any other final thoughts or comment from you guys?
Appreciate all the comments today. I didn't have a lot to share, but I certainly benefited from the questions that have been submitted by those who are viewing online and by our brothers here in the chat.
That's a good point.
I enjoyed being on.
Thoughts, Paul. You know, thoughts?
I enjoyed being on with you guys always.
Well, appreciate it, Bob. We enjoy being with you too now, and we appreciate being with you. Thank you so much for joining us for our study. If you want to contact us, you can send us emails, send it to questions@truthfactorlive.com, or email us individually as you see on the screen there, john@paul@truthfactor.com.
John, you're not standing.
No, I'm not. I'm at home.
You're usually out standing in the field, but now you're sitting in the field.
Yeah, that's right. All right, everyone. Thank you so much, and we'll see you back here, Lord willing, next Thursday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time for another Truth Factor discussion. Y'all have a wonderful week.